everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really lovely to be with you all today and to talk about some of the work that I've done in various industries from an academic perspective. So I wanted to begin the talk by thinking back to a pre-digital age and the type of relationships that we would have had with brands. So in the past, we might have had our own bank manager who knew us particularly well. They may have known if we were risk-seeking or risk-averse with our investments. Or maybe we would have had a travel agent who would have had a hunch about the type of holidays we'd like to go on based on whether we were interested in something that was more relaxing or maybe something more adventurous. And so there'd be a personal experience based on us as an individual. Well, increasingly, although we have so much more data about individuals, we find that people are feeling increasingly more alienated. And although technology is associated with having wider reach with individuals, there's also the potential for people to feel as though they aren't an individual and as though things aren't really being tailored to them and brands don't really understand them. And this can really lead to a sense of dissatisfaction for individuals, and that can have an impact on brand loyalty as well. So even though companies have never had more data about the customers that they have, we find that digitisation and automation can make people feel increasingly isolated from those companies. And this has a real impact on how satisfied people are and their sense of loyalty to brands. And the key question that I work on with various brands and various industries is to look at how we can personally tailor the experience and turn that data into insight. So I'm a behavioral scientist, and in behavioral science, we combine psychology learnings with computational social sciences. And essentially, we think about ways in which we can learn about individuals based on them as an individual from their data. And in particular, the approach that I use uses the digital traces that we all leave behind when we engage with technology, be it our mobile banking apps or smartphones. And I use that to try and understand how the individual makes decisions and things about their personality. I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that I've done. The first one I'm going to talk about is in the space of museum visitors, and then the other one's completely different. It's looking at retail banking. But first of all, I'm going to talk about the British Museum. So this is a place which perhaps some of you have been to. It's the biggest tourist attraction in the UK. It has 6 million visitors each year and 8 million different objects spanning almost 2 million years of humanity. And what the museum wanted me to work on was data from their audio guide. So those of you who may have been there may have used their audio guide. And this contains information on 250 objects at the museum. And individuals can get information via the forms of audio, media, text, and images. And what the museum wanted to do is use data from 40,000 people to try and make predictions and improve the visitor experience. And the key question that they asked me to solve was, can we make recommendations to visitors based on what they've previously done? So the type of information that we had about various objects was where they're physically located in the museum, but we also had metadata about the individuals. So how long do they spend on each object? What's their attention span? How much time do they flip between objects? Are they rushing to the next one? Or maybe they're spending more time going to the cafe or to the shops. And also things about the object, so things like what type of historical period they're interested in, the theme of the object, and the geographical location of the object too. And my approach was to use a next best action marketing to try and understand what individuals were interested in looking at. So I looked at the type of objects that people were interested in previously in the visit, and then I tried to predict based on similar people who'd previously been to the museum. And I'm not going to talk about all of the machine learning algorithms and the data science, although if anyone is interested, I'd be very happy to talk about that over coffee. But suffice to say, we were able to use this to try and predict what objects people might be interested in the future. And we can categorize these into 4 different types of visitors. It's important to say that these weren't the only 4 we used. It really was tailored to the individual. But for the sense of explainability, we've got 4 different types here. So we have the committed tracker, the leisurely explorer, the targeted visitor, and the speedy sampler. And I think what's interesting about this is that what was predictive wasn't whether people liked Greek objects or modern objects, but actually it was how they approached things, what their attention span was, even things like whether they were willing to climb stairs and things as well was really important. So if we have somebody who is a targeted visitor, who's also in a group, we might suggest something like the Elgin Marbles because it's nice and big and people can crowd around. But if it's somebody who was a committed trekker who seems to be quite happy to climb stairs, we might suggest something like this nice Assyrian bracelet because it's a bit more intimate and quiet in those rooms. And I think what the museum found really interesting is that behavioral science was able to help to show some really unexpected insights about what's actually important to customers. So things that the museum hadn't really considered to be important were actually really important when people chose what object to look at. For example, whether or not someone was in a group, and we could tell this based on if anyone else was going around to the same things at the same time. One thing we found that was really important was how averse people are to stairs. So people really don't seem to like climbing stairs to go and see an object, but some people are more willing than others. And also people's preference for the epic versus more intimate, cerebral, smaller objects as well. So these were things that the museum hadn't considered, and if we hadn't done a data-driven approach, it wouldn't have revealed itself. But also things that the museum thought were important were surprisingly weak factors. So the native tongue of the visitor isn't very important. It's a bit of a stereotype to think that Chinese language visitors want to go and see those objects. Italian speakers just want to see the Roman objects. And even the theme didn't seem to be particularly important of the historical era too. So this means that we were able to have a really tailored to the individual experience. And it also meant that we could look at pinch points potentially when the museum gets pretty busy, which is often the case at the British Museum if you've been there, and sort of lean people towards those quieter routes as well. But what was really interesting is that we could get real-time feedback on our algorithm. People either accepted our advice or they didn't, and they went to look at something else. The second thing I wanted to talk about is completely different. It's my work in mass transactional bank data. So I work with a lot of retail banks, some large, some fintech, to try and help them understand decision-making and personality in their customers. And on the face of it, bank data can sound extremely dull and dry and not really representing somebody's personality. So if I think about somebody's bank statement, it might tell me what their salary is, what their monthly outgoings are, and if they have a loan. But actually, if you dig a little deeper, you can learn quite a lot about an individual based on their bank statement. And I often think of it as, if all I had about somebody who I'd never met was what they'd spent in a month, I'd actually know quite a lot about their habits and their personality. So for this person, it's a bit fuzzy, but I can see how much they spend at Starbucks. I can see how habitual they are at going to the supermarket. And I can see that they're really organized because they're paying their bills automatically rather than ad hoc. So suddenly we can start to build a picture about an individual. And I'm going to describe a couple of projects that I've done with retail banks. The first one is looking at how we can predict customers' personality from their spending habits so that we can give the customer a really unique experience based on their drives and their fears and anxieties. So I've got a little picture here of somebody who spends a lot on clubs and bars and restaurants. And you can ask yourself, do we think this is somebody who is high on extroversion or low on extroversion? Probably if somebody's spending a lot on bars and going out with their friends, they're pretty high on extroversion. And similarly, if somebody spends a lot on charities, we might think that they're more likely to be high on agreeableness than low on agreeableness. Now, we could either do this for every single merchant category, or we can do a more data-driven approach to try and see if we can predict personality. And this is exactly what we did. So we gave 2,000 customers a personality sample, personality questionnaire. And then we just looked at what they spent their money on across thousands of categories. And we were able to weight the association between that and their personality. The really interesting bit happens when you can then generalize that out and look at, say, 2 million customers, which we did, and try and predict their personality based on how they spend their money. And then the real proof in the pudding is to see if our targeted branding, which is based on their personality, can improve sales and engagement. So I'm not going to show the specific ads that we used for sensitivity reasons, but this is an example of where it's been done in published work. On the top row, we have a product being sold that's a beauty product, and we can see on the left it's targeted towards somebody who's high on extroversion. So it says dance like nobody's watching, but they totally are. Whereas on the right-hand side, we've got something that looks more like a sort of spa day, and it's about pampering and treating yourself. And then on the bottom, we have something similar, but for high and low openness. And what we find is that using the concurrent version that matches somebody's personality can really drive sales. And that's what we found for our banking example as well. The final one that I'm going to talk about is another banking product that we looked at. But this is a bit more interesting because instead of looking at the individual's personality, we're looking at the individuals who are in their peer groups. And we were able to construct their peer groups from bank data. So in the psychological and behavioral economic literature, we know that people's spending is influenced by the people who are around them in their workplace or their neighborhood. So if I'm surrounded by people who earn less than me, I'll feel really secure about my status in the group, that I have high status. I don't feel the need to prove it to anyone. But if I'm surrounded by people who earn more than me, perhaps I feel a bit more insecure and I feel the need to overcompensate to elevate my status. And one of the ways that we see that people overcompensate is by spending more on high status goods. Now, this has implications for consumer behavior, but for a retail bank, it also has implications for creditworthiness. So maybe you don't want to be lending to somebody who's going to spend their money on things that maybe aren't great investments, but are quite flashy. So I'm going to give an example here using a football reference, and any football fans will notice that the players and the teams are a little bit outdated. I made these slides before Paul Pogba left United, but we've got two players here. Harry Kane on the top, who plays for Spurs, and we've got Paul Pogba at the bottom, who did play for United, Manchester United. And they both earn £200,000. And the question is, who feels more comfortable with their status? Well, you might think they probably are both feeling pretty good on that salary. But I'll give you a bit more context about both players. So in Harry Kane's squad, he's the highest earner. He's the captain, he's also the England captain, and nobody's earning more than him, so he's feeling pretty good about himself. Whereas in Paul Pogba's lineup, he's pretty low in the pecking order. Even though he has the same cash taking home as Harry Kane, only two regular players that start are earning less than him. So the question is, who feels better about their status? What we found is that we could construct similar networks using bank data because we have people's payroll coming in for millions of people in the country. So we can infer who works with whom based on payroll and where they are in the ranking. We excluded this to just be looking at small and medium firms because if we're looking at a large employer like the NHS, people suddenly start to not really know each other. So we did this for 700,000 people in 34,000 firms. And we looked at their rank in their organization, controlling for how much money they were earning. And then we looked at what they spent their cash on across 10 months. And we were able to categorize 83% of spending, which is over 4,000 merchants, as luxury goods, discretionary or necessities. What we found is that people like Paul Pogba are more likely to spend money on expensive jewelry, on luxury cars, and on expensive holidays. And the intuition is that even though people don't necessarily have as much cash as these footballers, we do still see these effects in people on lower, medium, and higher incomes, where people feel the need to overcompensate, even though they have the same income, because they feel a bit less confident about their status in their peer group. So those are a few examples of the type of work that I've done to look into combining academic insights from behavioral science and computer science with working with industry partners. And I think the message that I really want to leave you with is that although companies have so much data, there's a real disconnect between actually knowing who individuals are and how we can personalize it to the individual. And I think that what's really needed is not just an understanding of computer science and data, but also an understanding of what the data means. Otherwise, you'll have really good models that can't generalize and fit to other data. And I think that we really need an understanding of marketing and psychological science as well as data science so that we can tailor things to the individual. Okay, thank you so much for your attention. And I'll leave it there and hand over to the next speaker. Thank you.